Hi, this is Street Life and I'm Natasha, back at it with review and discussion of Bob Marley, One Love. To start with, I want to be very clear that I went to see Bob Marley, One Love on February 14th, Valentine's Day, the very day that it came out. This was after having seen trailers for the movie back in 2023. Despite sometimes when, I'm looking forward to movies or something along these lines, not to say that I built up expectations for it to be an incredible movie, but just that it was something I was looking forward to. And I find sometimes, as has been my experience with a few recent movies, when I actually go to theaters, it falls short. So I was tentatively looking forward to Bob Marley One Love as, I didn't read any reviews or read into it in advance, but I knew that the Marley family was involved, as well as Kingsley Benadir and Lashana Lynch were going to be starring in the film. But beyond that, I didn't know much else about who would be filling out the rest of the cast, as far as who would be portraying the other characters. With that being said, I will say that something I enjoyed about this film as someone of Caribbean descent, with my father being from Jamaica, my mother being from Guyana, and then my mother's parents, some generations back, having their families originated in Barbados. I grew up in Flatbush in Brooklyn, New York, which at the time I was growing up was very heavily West Indian, very heavy Caribbean presence. So I grew up immersed in Caribbean culture, both within my house and then also within my community. And something that's always bothered me about watching movies with characters from the Caribbean is the accent. Watching movies, television, quite often Caribbean accents tend to be terrible. It's quite often, regardless of whatever island the person is supposed to be from, I don't know if it's a lack of research, preparation, regardless, whatever island the character is supposed to be from, they're typically portrayed with a bad Jamaican accent. So, and I take issue with that because when you have films taking place in various European countries, like period pieces where they're doing, be it French accents, British accents, German, or whatever the case might be, they get those right, or they come quite close to it. And part of that is working with dialect coaches, acting coaches, doing your research and whatnot to make sure that those accents are accurate. And then it's with films where you have characters that are supposed to be from the Caribbean, the accent is just completely wrong. The time and effort isn't put into getting those accents right. And that tends to be a sticking point for me going into films. And so in preparing to watch this movie, that was one of my concerns, that the accents would be just completely atrocious. And I was pleasantly surprised that, for the most part, that's not the case here. Kingsley Benadir, in portraying Bob Marley, actually does a pretty decent job with the accent. Actually, more than decent. He does a good job with the accent. To be fair, there are a few points in the film where, you hear the accent goes a little bit off course. But for the most part, I felt he did a pretty good job. Lashana Lynch, now, she was fairly spot on with the accent. And I think that in part comes from her being of Jamaican descent. Her getting the accent right. It was correct and it remained consistent throughout the film. And as far as the rest of the supporting cast, I wasn't really familiar with any of these actors or actresses, but I felt like for the most part, they did good jobs with their accents. And that was one of my major concerns going into the film. But having seen it, I felt like I was pretty happy, right? It wasn't too much of an issue in viewing the movie. And beyond that, I felt like the actors were pretty good. Now, onto the movie more broadly. With regards to the movie, to be clear, I saw it on Wednesday night, which was Valentine's Day, and actually enjoyed it quite much. And actually enjoyed it very much, to the point where, had it been earlier, I probably would have seen the movie again. Especially because I knew I wanted to do a review of the movie. I feel like sometimes watching movies once through, I'm focused on just enjoying it and not so much paying as close attention. So I felt like I might have missed some things, but I enjoyed it enough where I know that I want to see it again. And so with that, I'm recording this review on Friday, and I'm planning to go see it again this evening. Actually, right after I'm done making this review. Now, to be clear, the movie for what it is, I think is actually quite good. I don't know if it's a matter of budgets not being put behind Black films or whatever it is, but the production quality tends to be lacking in comparison to even bad mainstream white movies. But here, I felt like they did a relatively good job, where I ended up enjoying the film. But the problem with the movie, though, is number one, I was surprised that it clocked in at an hour and 40 some odd minutes. Now, for someone like Bob Marley's stature, who's an icon within certainly Jamaica and within reggae music, but more broadly music in general, I felt this wouldn't be a long enough runtime to really do his story justice. But in sitting through the movie, I realized that part of this is because it's not really the story of Bob Marley's life, but rather the story of a particular period in his life, largely the time between the iconic 1976 Smile Jamaica and 1978 One Love concerts. During this period, there was a lot of political turmoil in Jamaica. The reason being that you had these two political parties vying for power. One was headed up by Edward Seaga and the other Michael Manley, very prominent figures in Jamaica. Not going to get too much into them, but basically with these two warring political parties, it spilled over into the streets where you then had, let's say like each one of the political parties had their associated street factions. I don't want to call them gangs, but basically you ended up having like fighting, gunfights and whatnot taking place in the street, violence in the streets, tied back to these political shenanigans. And so the idea was developed to put together this Smile Jamaica concert on December 5th, 1976, where it was intended to ease some of the tensions within the country as elections were coming up, lots of shady business going on. But the plan was to have this concert at which Bob Marley and other artists would perform as a way of kind of beginning to heal this rift in Jamaica. What ended up happening instead was that in the lead up to this concert, gunmen entered Bob Marley's compound and attacked him and several other people, shooting him, Rita Marley, his manager, just really unleashing havoc in his compound, really as an act of political intimidation, trying to shut Bob Marley up. He was speaking out about the violence, things like that, not really taking a political stand, as he wasn't for one party or the other, at least not publicly so, but really taking a stand against the violence. So you had this ambush where gunmen ran into the compound, really aiming to kill him and the people closest to him. As a result of this act of violence and the turmoil within the country, he left Jamaica. Rita and the children went to America to stay with his mother, and Bob then went to London where he remained for about 2 years, during which time he began working on what would become the Exodus album. And so that's what we get here. He then returned to Jamaica in 1978 for the One Love concert, which once again was an attempt to kind of heal this political rift. As when he left Jamaica, the violence continued and escalated, where the two leaders of the warring factions, which were Bucky Marshall and Claude Massa, they called a truce, but there was a fear that they wouldn't be able to control their groups for long. So Bob Marley was called upon, or rather asked to return to Jamaica in 1978 for the One Love concert, another attempt to try to calm some of the tension that had been brought about due to the politics within the country. But where the film really focuses is these two events and the time in between. So it's like, unfortunately, Bob Marley passed away at the relatively young age of 36 from cancer. And so even with that, the film just focuses on about 2 years of his life, the period between surrounding these two concerts. So going into it, I think if you have that understanding and set your expectations that this isn't going to be the life story of Bob Marley, but rather the story of a particular time in his life, then I think you might find the film more enjoyable. Like I said, I didn't read reviews or anything like that, so I was kind of expecting that the film would touch on these moments from his life, but that it would also be more broadly about his life and career. And you do get some flashbacks to moments from his childhood, his young adulthood, him meeting and starting this relationship with Rita Marley and their time together over the years. But the bulk of the film really focuses on roughly just 2 years out of his life. And so with that, don't get me wrong, the movie is good for what it is with regards to getting a brief overview of the political situation in Jamaica, seeing the creative development of the Exodus album and the tour that followed. But if you're going into this movie expecting for it to be the definitive story of Bob Marley, I think you're going to end up being disappointed. And so while I enjoyed the movie for what it is, because like I said, I enjoyed seeing like the inspiration for some of these very iconic Bob Marley songs, seeing really a snapshot of this moment in his life, kind of going from being a star there in Jamaica to become like the start of him becoming an international superstar. I walked away from the film feeling like, number one, it felt very short. It covered a bit too much and at the same time too little. Where I feel like if the film was really going to just focus on these 2 years from his life, that it needed to have a tighter focus on these 2 years. Because it's like some of the flashbacks to him and Rita, yes, those worked. But at the same time, the film overall felt a little bit rushed. As someone with some background knowledge of, Rastafarianism, Haile Selassie, the Rastafarian faith, the history of Jamaica, Rita Marley, Bob Marley, and beyond that, Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh, I went into the film and I was able to kind of fill in some of the gaps, but I think people who really just know Bob Marley's music and don't have much background knowledge, it might be a bit difficult to follow the story or to really get the full gist of the story and everything that's taken place. Because they try to cram so much in that while at the same time focusing on this specific time period, it's like if you don't have like the background knowledge, you'll end up missing out on a lot. Like the Wailers, which would be Bob Marley, Bunny Wailer, and Peter Tosh, who were legends in their own right, maybe not at the same international level as Bob Marley, but legends on their own within reggae. They're really just shown and mentioned in a passing glance. You don't really learn much about their early career and how exactly they got started as a group in music. Really, the only reference we see to that is Bob and these two guys, where you'd have to know that it's Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, going into a studio, which I would think would be Studio One, with who's supposed to be Cox and Dot, to audition. And it's like, you've got these two guys here with young Bob, and then you kind of have to know who Cox and Dot is and how important he is to the history of reggae music to fill in the gaps, because there's no real explanation here. And the scene is actually quite short. So what ends up happening is they go into this audition, and as far as I can recall, I think it's really the only time you see Bunny Wailer and Peter Tosh. There's no real full exploration of the Wailers, which as you can see from the album, it's Bob Marley and the Wailers. So you see Bob Marley, but there's no explanation of the history of the Wailers. You might think it's just like his backing band. Even like the I3s, you might think it's just Rita Marley and some random backup singers. They had a good recipe here because although Kingsley Ben-Adir might not look exactly like Bob Marley, I felt like he did a good enough job of capturing his feeling, his essence. The story is good for what it is, but I feel like it's supposed to be focused on like these bookend concerts and the time in between. But in jumping out of that and really just taking these really just having this surface level conversation of other moments from Bob's life, you feel like there's too much going on and at the same time too little. I've seen a few movies clocking in at like a good 2+ hours, 3 hours, and those were movies that weren't very good and probably should have been trimmed down quite a bit. With this movie here, you have like a recipe for it to be really great, and it's good at 1 hour and 40 something minutes, but I think that had they extended it and dove more into Bob's early life, like a huge part of his story, which they make reference to in really just the opening credits, this thing of him coming from humble beginnings. But it's not fully explored. Him being in a government yard in Trenchtown, but not actually seeing Trenchtown and just how rough and tumble the place was, really showing you his humble beginnings and the significance of him making his way from this very poor environment. And even beyond that, going back to him being from St. Anne's Parish, this place out in the country, to the perspective, how it affected his perspective on the world, really just glossing over that, it takes away some of the impact of his early life. It's assumed that you as the audience already know this, but it takes away from the impact of where he goes and not just how he transforms his music, but how these experiences transform his life, affect him as a person. This thing of like the stone that the builder refused becoming the head cornerstone, which really comes from Bob Marley being the child of a white British man and a black Jamaican mother, and the family dynamic at play, where, he was raised by his mother's black family. And the movie kind of wobbles this a little bit, where it sounds like he's never really met or seen his father or anything like that, but that's not really the case. If I'm not mistaken, for a period of his early life, he was with his father's family, but it wasn't the same thing as being with his mother's family. He was kind of rejected by them, right? And that certainly had an impact on his development. It's touched on here, his mother leaving Jamaica to go to Delaware, but it's not shown that Bob actually spent some time living in Delaware. And that initially his mother pushed for him to go to school and find a regular job and whatnot, but instead he made the choice that music was for him and that was going to be his pathway to a better life. And I mean, we've seen that in like other films and whatnot, but it's important that those early moments, which play a crucial role in his development as an artist, the artist that he would become, they're not really explored. So it's like you have some missed opportunities here. Basically, what you see here is the making of an icon, but you don't really get to see the journey of that icon really just first becoming a man. It's more about Bob Marley becoming this legendary superstar and less so about him becoming a legend, which are two different things. It's like there's a lot of focus on this period in his life where he became immensely popular outside of Jamaica, was making moves outside of Jamaica, but it then takes away from why he's so significant in Jamaican culture. It kind of feels like it's a movie for the masses, and even there, it does a disservice because it assumes that you know his backstory, and at the same time, it does a disservice for his role as an icon within Jamaican history because it barely touches on his life in Jamaica, as for much of the film, he's outside of Jamaica. Something that's a drawback for me when you have like authorized biographies and biopics, whether it's authorized by the individual or their family, is that I think sometimes more focus is placed on maintaining the image of this figure rather than telling their human story. They kind of touch on the less savory aspects of his character, but it's really just touched on, more accurately glossed over. And I feel like the nuts and bolts of people, they're good points, yes. Their, amazing achievements are important, but at the same time, I think it's also important to discuss their humanity, their flaws and shortcomings, mistakes they've made along the way, the trips and falls that they've had on their way to greatness. So it's not just this thing of a push to glory while overlooking their stumbles and falls along the way or their humble beginnings. I feel those kinds of stories are more impactful. And yes, they touch on it. There's like a scene between Bob and Rita where they're in Paris. They have a falling out, an argument. And Rita's telling Bob that he's changing. And as part of the conversation, it's touched on about him really being a womanizer, having these outside kids. There's brief mention of the breakup with him and the Wailers, which would be the division between Bob Marley, Bunny Wailer, and Peter Tosh, but there's no real explanation or exploration of it. We see a scene where Bob is on the phone with Rita and you see a woman standing by. You can make inferences there, but it's like it's so vague that it could just be some random woman where, a huge part of Bob's personal life is him having all of these kids by the age of 36 with several different women. There's little conversation about his relationship with his mother, and then also his philosophy and ideology. Rastafarianism is touched upon. There's mention of Haile Selassie. There's some explanation of Rastafarianism and like I and overstanding. But it's like, it's touched upon at a surface level. There's such depth to Bob Marley's life and to these various aspects of his character that it's like to have it be such a short film, it feels heavily condensed. It feels like where other movies sometimes they leave too much in, with this movie, it feels like they've left too much out. But don't get me wrong, it's still a good film, but I think because it doesn't dive deeply enough into Bob Marley, it can't be viewed as the definitive Bob Marley film. And with some of the icons, you think about it like musicians, figures from history and whatnot, you'll have like a good 3 or 4 documentaries, multiple books, multiple movies about their lives. But quite often with Black icons, like you look at it with Bob Marley, where he's not just an iconic Black icon or an iconic Jamaican icon, he's iconic within music, right? At an international level, where there's been some documentaries, there've been some books, but as I can recall, I think this is the only Bob Marley movie. I remember there being talk of his family trying to put together a Bob Marley movie since way back in the 90s. That would have been like 98, 99. And here we are in 2024 when the film is finally coming out. That's a good 24, 25 years ago. And in that time, you've had one film made about his life. And the film comes out and it's still not the definitive Bob Marley movie. It's like how many more decades are going to go by? And will there still be interest that many decades into the future to push to make the definitive Bob Marley movie? So I feel like while this film is good, I feel like it's a missed opportunity because it took so long to get this movie made that they should have made sure that this was the Bob Marley movie. Because you look at it, if it takes another 20 to 25 years to make a push for like the Bob Marley movie, the movie of his life, will Rita Marley still be here? Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer are gone. How many of his kids would still be around at that time? And that's my thing with biopics, especially when it comes to Black icons, that it tends to take forever for these movies to get made. You're fortunate if you get like the right actor and actress, you get the right cast, and then, sometimes the story doesn't even encompass enough to make the definitive film. And we as Black people, where our stories aren't quite told at the same scale and at the same frequency as with mainstream white movies, when we get these opportunities, you kind of have to assume that you might just get this one shot to make the film. So it's like the first shot you get, you need to make a push to make sure that the movie is the definitive movie, that anything that comes after stands in comparison to that first movie, because you might not get a second shot. And that's where my disappointment comes in with this movie. For what it is, I think it's actually a good film. It's good enough where I enjoyed the music, I enjoyed seeing the behind the scenes of how the songs were inspired, how the Exodus album came together. But at the same time, I've read the books, I've seen the documentary, I want to see the movie of Bob Marley's life. And I feel like they had the right ingredients here. It's like you think of baking, right? You have nice, fresh ingredients, but settle for a pound cake when you could have put a little bit more in and had like Black Forest cake or tiramisu. Pound cake is good, but you could have made something more special and legendary. Especially for someone of this nature, I feel like Bob Marley deserved it. He deserved an epic and legendary movie on the scale of what his contributions to music has been. And I feel like in that regard, the movie, for sure, it's still a good movie, but I feel like it's not the epic biopic that it could have been and should have been.
Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist. Go ahead and click the thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.